Hey, hello, everybody. Welcome to Hard Money Gym, where we like to discuss money creation and its consequences. I'm speaking today again from beautiful Coronado, California, where the sun is shining out there, and even better, the pandemic mandates are dissolving, even here in the People's Republic of California. So hopefully, as people tire of all this madness, we'll put much of this pandemic behind us, although no doubt what our governments have done will have some lasting political effects. Now, we'll talk a little bit about government involvement in the economy later in the form of price controls, but right now let's complete our discussion of the effects of excessive money creation. Let's go back to our list that we've been using. Okay. We've been discussing the effects of money creation, the unprecedented increase of forced injection of money into the economy by a combination of the Federal Reserve, congressional action, executive action. We've seen lots of government borrowing and spending. Most of that borrowing has been monetized through quantitative easing. And we've had emergency legislation that promotes bank lending, and that lending has been guaranteed by the government. And all these things put us where we're now in a position that nearly 30% of the money that's ever existed in the USA has been poured into the economy just over the last 2 years. Put another way, that's an increase over the previous level of money supply of nearly 40%. And as I've said, when you have this kind of flood of money, a flood of this magnitude, the effects become more obvious than they would have been if it was gradual. So it's a great opportunity to observe in near real time the effects of excessive money creation. So that's what we've been doing. And we've talked a lot about these effects, including asset price inflation, which increases the money value of assets owned by the rich. And then its flip side, low interest rates, which make traditional saving almost impossible for the middle class, at least. And we've talked about the false corporate profits that arise in an inflationary environment, along with that false sense of prosperity and the sort of the casino mentality, as I call it, that arises among many in the population as inflation progresses. And of course, there's the obvious thing, rising consumer prices, which practically everyone thinks is the whole story of inflation. But consumer prices really is just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on during an inflation, as I am trying to illustrate with all these other examples. So today, we're going to wrap up these points with a two-part discussion. You can see on the check marks there. First, it'll be a discussion of how excessive money creation increases the cost of shelter, whether you own your home or rent your home. And second, why I think we are likely to see price controls of some kind imposed by government in the near future. I would like very much to be wrong about that, but I do fear that price controls may be in the works, and we'll get into that later. Okay, so first, what most economists call inflation is an increase in the consumer price index, the CPI. And the CPI, which is computed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, assigns weightings to various categories of spending, such as shelter, food, apparel, transportation, education, and so on. And the Bureau studies and surveys thousands of people pretty constantly to determine what they're spending their money on. And through a complicated process, they record spending trends and they try to determine patterns of price changes throughout the economy. And today, consumer price indexes like the CPI here, and a similar index called the PCE, which the Fed uses for their own targeting, are the sole measure of inflation that most people use. This is what they mean when they say inflation, at least when economists say inflation. That's most people, but not us here. Okay. Now, I understand that, I contend actually, that CPI understates the inflation experience for the average person for a number of reasons. And I really can't get into all the details, but I want to give you an indication today. And if you want, you can follow up and understand how you may be getting slightly deceived if you rely on this consumer price index as your major measure of what inflation is doing out there. So first, the BLS routinely makes downward adjustments in prices because of quality improvements in products. So for example, a computer that's a new computer that's faster this year than it was than a similar model last year might actually have its reported price adjusted downward for the sake of the CPI, even though the dollar price of that computer went up. Now that may astonish you, but they do this. This is called hedonic price adjustment, HEDONIC. You can look it up, read about it. It's complicated. I would say it's not complicated in concept. It's complicated the way they apply it. But hedonic price adjustments, you can search and read about them if you want. And another thing the BLS does is they make regular substitutions to the CPI that hide price increases. Now, suppose, for example, people have been eating steak, a lot of steak. That's me, okay? I love beef. But steak prices go way up. So then people stop eating steak because they can't afford it. They start eating hamburger and potatoes. So the BLS will then remove steak from the index, and they'll substitute hamburger and potatoes, including those lower prices, the lower amount of money spent on hamburger and potatoes. So those policies do reflect what people are doing. They do reflect spending changing patterns, but it would misrepresent over time the inflation experience of the person who eats steak. Okay, so for these kinds of reasons alone, the CPI as a real truth-telling indicator of inflation is suspect. Now, the CPI was not always computed with those kinds of discretionary adjustments. These adjustments that I just described were adopted in the early 1980s when inflation was running in double digits. And it was done, these were adopted to reduce the cost of living adjustments that the government had to pay to Social Security recipients. And there is an economist who attempts to compute inflation by the pre-1980s method. His name is John Williams, and he runs a site called shadowstats.com. And according to him, computed the old way, inflation is not 7%, but 15%. So take that for what it's worth. That would not be a definitive number either, I don't think, but it shows you the difference that can be arrived at by different, both reasonable computation methods. But today, rather than focus on this, I'd like to illustrate to you something that may be important to you, how the CPI understates shelter costs, and that is housing costs. And this will illustrate, when we get into this will illustrate two important points. And one is that the cost of owning your own shelter is not even counted in the CPI, despite the fact that 80 million Americans are homeowners. And the second thing it will illustrate is that rental rates themselves are understated by quite a bit. So the CPI contains, you probably know this, contains cost categories like food and energy and household commodities and so forth. And these are all broken down further into individual items. And so here are just some examples. And by no means, this is only a tiny partial list here. The largest category note is the aforementioned shelter component, which is takes up almost 1/3 of the overall index. So since price changes in each of these categories are weighted by the percentage in the index, the changes in the cost of shelter have a big impact on the overall index. So shelter is the most significant cost borne by most people, and correctly, it's the most significant cost weighting in the index. So now, according to the BLS data, the average price of shelter in 2021, January to December, was up 4.1% in the 12 months ended December 2021. Now, that is much less than the overall CPI number that we just saw a minute ago, which was 7%. And that might make it appear that the cost of shelter, either owning or renting, is rising more slowly than the overall CPI. So put another way, the increase in the cost of shelter added only 1.3% to the overall index increase of 7%. Now, the way you get that is take the reported percent increase in the CPI, 4.1%, multiply that by the shelter component, 32.4%, and you will get a contributing increase of 1.3%. Now, that might sound like pretty good news. That looks, like it's small, 4%. That might be pretty good news to anyone who's looking for a house or looking to, change their apartment or buy a house. But I would warn you, do not base your decision to move or to plan your budget based on that metric. So let's now look at what really happened to the cost of owning a home. The median home price is up 27% in the USA in the last 2 years. And it's up 20% in the last year alone. Again, that is almost, I believe that's unprecedented. It's certainly unprecedented as far back as I could find the data. So let's just review quickly, since our theme is money creation and its effects, its consequences, let's review quickly how money creation raises the cost of home ownership. Let's recall that money creation, money is created, I should say, through quantitative easing, and it's used to purchase many bonds, including mortgage bonds. And this provides a market for the Fed, then provides a market into which banks can sell their loans, which they're incentivized to create even more loans by more lending. Then the Feds purchase mortgages, by these mortgage-backed bonds that they buy, raises the value of those mortgage bonds, lowering the interest rate paid on future mortgage bonds, which is what you can see in this chart here. We talked about that process last week, as you'll recall. Now, those new higher prices or lower rates then and more money available, I don't want to skip a step here, makes more money available to buy homes, more money available for people to buy homes with, and therefore it raises the demand for houses, which therefore raises the price of houses. And those new higher prices are then the basis for new value assessments that are used by collateral for yet more loans. So after this circular process occurs for a while, a speculative element kind of settles in where both borrowers and banks think they can't lose. And this is how you develop asset bubbles. This kind of a pattern you see in asset bubbles almost, well, certainly every time they occur. And so this kind of conveyor belt of money creation, lower rates, and house buying is also encouraged and aided by subsidies in the housing market, at least in the USA, such as the deductibility of mortgage interest, guarantees on mortgage bonds by various government agencies, and government regulation that directs lending toward people who would otherwise be a poor home risk. For example, the Community Reinvestment Act in the USA, and so on. And now you add to all this the action of the Fed and the regulators, which encourages, house price increases. Now you add a shift in the demand from city living in single family to single family homes in the suburb, which is what we're seeing since the pandemic. And I think you have all the elements you need for much higher house prices. So in one of the pieces I wrote, I documented this before in some detailed numbers just to make it real. And I'm just showing this, you may have seen this already, but I'm just showing this to you, what has happened to the cost of buying a home. I mean, look at your down payment. It went up over 20%. It's pretty hefty. That's just the median home. It's also true that mortgage rates have increased slightly, and that you can. I just put that in there to show you what that adds, what an increase in mortgage rates does to the monthly cost of owning. But you can look at that and tell me if that is affordable or if that is reflective of a 4% increase in home owning. Because again, this is not included when calculating the CPI. So it is a far cry. 4% is a far cry from this. How do you explain this vast difference? And the answer lies in how the BLS calculates the cost of shelter. The Bureau of Labor Statistics estimate does not attempt to estimate the cost of paying interest and principal and taxes and insurance on a home. Instead, they use a simple and naive estimating technique adopted in the early 80s that does understate shelter costs. And here's what they do. Most of the cost of shelter comes from a line item called owner's equivalent rent. Let me go back there real quick in case you missed that. Okay, see under shelter, there's OER, owner's equivalent rent, and then there's rent of primary residence. And those are the main components of the overall shelter component, okay? And every month, the BLS government employees just simply call up on the phone thousands of homeowners, and they ask them to guess how much they think a renter might pay for the home they're living in. And I did not mistake that. That is what they do. They ask people to guess. Most homeowners have no real clear idea how much their homes would rent because they don't have any reason to know. They may have never thought about it or may not have thought about it for years. So when they're just asked to, how much would your home rent for? I think they're likely to bias their answer toward historically low numbers. They're likely to have no idea about the recent effects of inflation. And there's another important factor that understates inflation in shelter costs. And these owner equivalent rent surveys are done every month. But the most recent monthly number that they get from these surveys is averaged in with the previous 5 months data. So the numbers are phased in actually over 6 months. And you could easily see that in a rapidly rising market like we have, the current reported number would be substantially lower than the actual current rate of increase. All right, so the remainder of the shelter category is called rent of primary residence. And it's derived from more accurate surveys. It's a smaller percentage of the index, but it's derived from surveys of those who actually pay rent for their apartments. So they call up and ask, how much are you paying for your rent? And of course, most people would know this. And but how does the 4% increase stack up to the real world of new rentals? So you can easily see what new apartments are renting for or what new leases are going for. You can go to apartmentguide.com or any number of websites in places all over the country, or you can read in Bloomberg here's a Washington Post article that rents are up more than 30% in some cities, forcing millions to find another place to live. I just consider that rented homes change renters and rental contracts every 3 to 5 years. So today's 20% apartment increase will only affect 20 to 30% of all apartments. However, as leases expire and the new higher prices are applied, the rest of the nation's rental inventory will increase in price. It'll catch up. So once again, in the primary rent category, we have a lag in the data with a strong upward bias. And so equally important, the lag built into the index's dominant shelter component assures us that these high CPI numbers, high shelter CPI increases, are going to be persistent in the index for many more months because the higher numbers are still waiting to go into the index. So what could the CPI look like in 6 months? We've seen that both home ownership costs and rents have risen about 20% in the last year. So just back of the envelope, if we apply an overall increase of 20% in the CPI, that cost of lodging, that alone might raise the CPI by 6.5%. Now, the way I get that is I take a 20% price increase for either rent or buying, and I multiply that times the index weighting, which is 32.4%, and you get 6.5% increase in cost of living just from shelter alone. Now you add to that the 5% increase that's accounted for by the other non-shelter CPI components. And you could be looking at annual CPI inflation in like the range of 11%, which many people would find alarming. Now that calculation that I just did there is not a prediction at all. I don't know that that's going to happen, but it's not an unreasonable analysis of what persistent inflation could look like and how it might be reported in the financial media. Okay, so I should have, I guess I'm sorry a little bit for the deep wonky dive there, but I wanted to illustrate that the CPI understates the inflation experience of many and perhaps most people. And this, again, it's hedonic pricing, substitution effects, the methods by which they gather data, and it especially understates the increase in the cost of shelter in a rapidly rising market like the one we're in now, a market of rapidly rising home prices. And because of the lag in the data and the heavy weight of sheltering the CPI. High CPI numbers are really baked into the CPI reports for the next 6 months or so. So we're likely to see high CPI numbers no matter what happens to other items like food or gas or clothing prices. So, I think before I want to say that what I expect to be the persistence of the most popular measure of inflation, the CPI, is going to be a factor in the possibility of seeing price controls. I mean, think midterm election, lots of scary inflation statistics to politicians will use to fix blame on each other. And I think inflation will be a big issue in the coming political year, and the debate will focus on the CPI, even though it probably shouldn't. Okay, so I want to pause right there and see if there's any questions or super chat items that I can answer. Dylan, do we have anything I should address?
Okay, so we don't have any questions, but we do have a couple super chats. So we have two from Mary Aline and one from Kirk. And Kirk says, I just want to thank Jim. I've been enjoying his shows.
Wow. I hope you can't see that I'm blushing. Thank you. I deeply appreciate that. I might add, before I get into price controls, that if you want to read my Substack articles, that is a great place to engage. If you want to read them and make comments and engage with me, I would really appreciate it. Of course, if you like them, hit the like icon. But I like feedback. The feedback you've been giving me is very positive. I hope it's objective. Okay, but thank you very much, Marilyn and Kirk. I appreciate it very much. Okay, so now I want to talk about the last and what I consider the most damaging potential result of inflation, and that's the prospect that the government will implement price controls. And I want to say a word or two about why I believe that governments, whether at the federal or local level, or perhaps both, are going to impose price controls in some form or manner in the coming years. And I have basically 4 reasons that I want to go through as to why I think this. And the first one is ignorance. Policymakers will definitely diagnose the reasons for inflation incorrectly. I'm sure of this. The Fed, the president, the Congress, they do not see or understand, or at least if they do, they deny it, that excessive money creation is a cause for across-the-board price increases. Elizabeth Warren, for example, a senator from Massachusetts who sits on the U.S. Senate Banking Committee, she's supposed to be an expert, is apparently not even aware of the role of money creation in inflation. She blames inflation on corporate greed, price gouging, and so forth. And I tell you, if you make the wrong diagnosis, you will create the wrong response. I mean, if you think that noise in the jungle you're walking through behind and back in the weeds there is a monkey, and it really turns out to be a man-eating tiger, you are likely to make a serious mistake. Ignorance leads to a wrong diagnosis. Wrong diagnosis means wrong response. Wrong response means higher risk of disaster. So I expect, an ignorant response. Okay, reason 2 that I think we may get price controls. Consumer inflation is basically a flashpoint of voter anger, and rightly so. I mean, you've seen over the last years a growing anger about asset price inflation, the unjust wealth distribution that's caused by quantitative easing. The Fed understood this was happening. The Wall Street understood this was happening. We talked about that. And I think Main Street has caught on to a significant extent that this is happening. And you've had, because of that, some Main Street populist anger about unjust inequality. But what you've seen, I contend, is nothing compared to the anger that you'll get from persistent increases in everyday prices of 5 or 6 or 8% or worse. Remember that something like 40% of Americans don't have any more than $1,000 of ready cash in their pocket or in a bank account. And when they see that their cash buys less and less, and they know that's not their fault, they are going to feel cheated. And they are going to blame the person who gets their money. That's the grocery store and Walmart and their landlord. And, many voters are going to look to their politicians to do something. So you can expect pressure from those who are harmed. Reason 3 that I think we'll see price controls. Politicians have proved that they are not afraid to act. So politicians on both the left and the right have very few qualms about intervening in the economy anymore. Ben Bernanke, the quantitative easer-in-chief, is a Republican. And we've seen this willingness to intervene on a large scale ever since the great financial crisis. Just think, if you will, what happened 2 years ago in the early weeks of 2020 when the pandemic just hit. At that time, most indicators, economic indicators, were pretty flashing green. Unemployment was low and the economy was doing pretty well. Then came this little microscopic bug that was kind of a spark that ignited the government lockdowns, which almost burned down the entire economy. And the problem was not from Wuhan, China. The problem was from Washington, D.C., in my view. The government's response then to their own self-inflicted damage of the lockdowns was a series of, kind of jaw-dropping money creation projects, funded by something like $6 trillion of new money, which we've talked about endlessly here. The entire government now, I'm speaking of the Fed, the Congress, the executive branch operating through Treasury, they have the power to act on the economy, and I contend they will not hesitate to use that power. Now, it's true that most economists, even those who are not so great, are not in favor of price controls. It's widely understood that price controls are a terrible response to make an economy recover. But politicians have the power, and they will always find an economist who will justify their position. They'll find somebody. And the Fed already exercises controls. The Fed is full of economists, and they already exercise controls that are similar to direct price controls. For example, they control or influence interest rates, especially short-term interest rates, which could be thought of as the price of borrowing money or the price of money. So if they have some theory, any theory, that justifies their actions, that will make their actions appear scientific, they're going to act. And if they're willing to act so radically to suppress interest rates to stimulate the economy like they've been doing for the last 12 years, I think it's very reasonable to think they'll attempt to control price increases if they see that consumer inflation is a threat to their political power, due to voter outrage. I mean, remember that inflation hurts the poor the most. So the impulse will be to help the poor by putting a lid on the prices paid by the poor. And of course, if they do this, it'll only make things worse. Okay. Reason 4 that I think we're likely to get price controls: short memories. Price controls on a large scale were tried over 50 years ago. In 1971, they were imposed by that famous great free market Republican, Richard Nixon. I remember this pretty well. These wage and price controls were a complete economic disaster. but few politicians and even fewer voters will remember. So without the memory of the failure of price controls, there won't be much resistance. So many people today are much younger, they don't know, and those who were there tend to forget the damage that was done. For example, they will forget the long lines for gas in the early 1970s, the gas rationing days. People still think that this was a problem due to an oil shortage that was caused by an embargo on Arab oil. But that's not true. It was really due to price controls on domestic oil that caused the rationing problem. And for a good account of that, I recommend you read George Reisman's The Government Against the Economy, and you can also get the same description of that in his book, Capitalism. People will forget their inability to find an apartment when they want to move into a city or a neighborhood that has rent controls. They will forget the stagnant economy that ensued for years after price controls were inflicted, because under price controls, a producer cannot make enough of a profit to reinvest and innovate. That results in stagnation. And that, unfortunately, is something people cannot directly observe. They just experience it. You can't observe the products and the improvements that should be coming to you. They forget the useless and unjust prosecutions of economic crimes like price gouging and other acts of economic survival. And they forget the inefficiencies of the black markets that arise to try to replace the normally functioning markets. Now, just to summarize this point of short memories, people just don't remember or understand that suppressing inflation, by controls will make things much worse than before the controls were implemented. Okay, now, finally, just a guess on my part. How do I think these price controls, if they come, will be implemented? Well, probably by the path of least resistance and on items that affect cost of living the most. And that would probably be, I think, rental rates. So in some places, there are still remnants of rent control, and it's actually popular among those who benefit from it. But the problem is the housing shortages that are created by rent control are not immediate, and therefore they're not going to be immediately noticed. So I would not be surprised to see a wave of regional rent control programs in a number of cities around the country. That is just a guess. Okay. In closing, let me introduce you to Dolly, my favorite horse and a loyal friend. So here's how to find me. Hard Money Jim on Substack, at Hard Money Jim on Twitter, Jim Brown CFA on LinkedIn. And I've just had a couple more short pieces published in Capitalism magazine. So again, please do me a favor. If you do engage me on, do read me on Substack, engage with a comment, because I'd love the feedback. Okay. And if you like the essay, hit the icon. Thanks for listening. And now if there are questions or any more super chats, let's have them.
Yeah, so Mary Elaine has a comment. She says, Elizabeth Warren belonged on the comet/ride into the tunnel.
Oh, well, okay. So I missed the middle of that. Would you please repeat that? I like it.
Elizabeth Warren belonged on the comet/ride.
On the comet/ride into.
And then,
oh, we could only wish, right, Marilyn? I mean, sometimes she is. I mean, you can get everyone. Politicians are practically all hypocrites. You can get past that. I mean, but the incredible unintelligence and the incredible insulting assumptions of how stupid she thinks we are. It just, okay, I'm going to stop there, but thank you for that comment.
And then from Gail says, thanks a million. I'll be sharing these. And then Enric says, thank you.
Oh, great. Well, thank you all. Even more, these are very helpful to me. These presentations help me organize and clarify my thinking. And so I really believe I get as much or more out of it than you do. So thank you very much. All right. I guess if we're done, we can say goodbye until next week.